Hi, everybody. My name is Kayode Alabi, and I'll be running a session on how to negotiate and negotiation. And I run Kayode Alabi Lashman Career Initiative, and throughout my years of work, I've had the opportunity to negotiate. I've also worked with different companies where I've also had to negotiate. So I'll be sharing from my own experiences, and I'll be sharing from my journey on how to negotiate and what does it mean to negotiate, and why do you even negotiate. So the conversation is going to revolve around the 5 W's of negotiation, which is like, how do you negotiate, what do you negotiate for, why do you negotiate, where do you negotiate, right? And who do you negotiate with as well. But before we look at that, we need to understand, the we need to understand what negotiation actually means. What is negotiation? Like, how do you negotiate? It's like, why do you have to negotiate? So the first thing is that we do negotiation every single day, but we don't know. For example, when you wake up in the morning, you're deciding which clothes to wear or which clothes not to wear. That's negotiation already. When you're trying to make a decision on which road to pass or which road not to pass, that's negotiation already. So every single day we have to negotiate. Every single day we have to decide. Every single day we have to decide on the food to eat or the food not to eat as well. So every single day we make decisions. And how do you actually build that into negotiating for what we want, such as salary, or into negotiating a contract? And that's something I want to share, right? And it's very important to start with why, for example. So why negotiation, for example? So I'm going to be talking about two whys of negotiation. The first why of negotiation is that, we don't, let's take, for example, salary, for example, again. We don't want to be paid less. We want to be paid more for our worth. We want to be paid more for what we can do. Want to be able to pay more for our effort as well. And that's a why, that's a strong why. But the second why is also why do you negotiate? So, for example, maybe you need more money to support your family. You need more money to, ensure that you can continue to support yourself and maybe even have enough to go for vacation, for example. And when you're able to connect a why to your negotiation, you're able to then find a way or find a meaning to negotiate. Because I found myself that when I'm fighting for something or when I'm fighting for somebody else, it drives me to then go and negotiate. Because most of the time, why am I negotiating? Why do I need to negotiate? And for somebody like me as well, who probably don't want to, get into conflicts, it's very important for me to have a driving force. I've noticed that whenever I'm fighting or advocating for something, it has to come from a deep-seated belief. It has to come from a driving force. So you need to find your driving force for negotiation. So that's the why we've covered. So then before we look at the why, what are you then negotiating for example? So we've touched upon that a little bit. So you're negotiating for, raise, you're negotiating to get a better deal, you're negotiating so that you don't get cheated. So those are the things you're negotiating for, and you're negotiating for yourself as well. So one of the things in negotiation is that most of the time we think about the other party, but we don't think about ourselves as well in the equation. So you have to always put yourself in the equation. Whenever I speak to some of my friends, I tell them first, when they are trying to maybe make up to me for some certain things, I'm like, you come first. Because sometimes you have to really put yourself at the equation. You have to put yourself in the mix of negotiation, and you need to think about what you really want as well for yourself. So I think, the first thing when you think about, negotiation, is also thinking about, right, yourself in the equation as well. And aside from the what, around what you're negotiating for, how do you then now negotiate, right? Or where do you negotiate? Before we even talk about the how, I think we should talk about the how last, because I think that's the most important part of negotiation. We need to talk about where do you negotiate. Most of the time we send emails trying to negotiate over the emails, and there are some certain things that get lost in text. In fact, personally, I don't like to talk in text. Like, even though I like to share in text, I mean, I share a lot on social media, but sometimes some messages get mixed in actually talking in text. But then when you have conversation, you are able to detonate some certain things as well. So it's very important to actually think about where you're negotiating. That maybe an email could be a first step of negotiation. So if you want to negotiate with your boss, for example, you can write an initial email about saying that, well, the salary you're paying me is not enough, or the offer you've given me is not enough. You can share some messages there, but you need to ask for a conversation, because those one-to-one conversation is where you're able to read emotions, you're able to watch somebody at their face, and you're able to really have conversation, and you're able to like break down some of the certain things you want to talk about, right? You need to like deconstruct, some of the things you want to talk about as well. So when we think about negotiation, right, we need to talk about where we are negotiating. I think I would favor face-to-face negotiation, or maybe probably a phone call, rather than an email conversation. An email conversation could be an extension of the beginning of a negotiation process, not the negotiation process itself, because I think you can get a better deal when you're actually like negotiating one-to-one. You're reading emotion, you're watching people by their, you're watching people, you're reading their emotions, you're looking them at their eyes, and I think that could go a long way in negotiation. Who do you also negotiate with? Yeah, like we said, we'll talk about the how later, but who do you negotiate with? You're negotiating with somebody who has the power to maybe increase your salary, for example, when we think about jobs, or somebody who can make decision on your contracts, right? Or somebody who has some level of decision making. So who are you negotiating with, right? It's very, very important. Who are you negotiating with? So obviously, when we think about unemployment settings, you're actually thinking about your boss, that is your hiring manager, who actually hired you. That's the person you're negotiating with. So you need to think about who you're negotiating with. And obviously, it just came to my head now that when you're thinking about who to negotiate to, you also need to think about who you might probably be negotiating with that is not in the room. And that means that you probably need to also do your research about other people who are in the decision-making space in the organization. So you're thinking about like, how would they influence that negotiating decision, that maybe your boss doesn't have all the decision as well, right? So you need to probably put that into account and put that into the negotiating process as you're thinking about negotiation. And how do you negotiate? Which is the main thing we want to talk about. How do you really negotiate? I think that's the question. That's the main question. The first thing you do when you're thinking about how to negotiate is to make sure that you have done your research. I think one thing that people mistaken, or one mistake that people do rather, is that they go into the negotiating room thinking that because somebody is probably earning more, obviously, which is okay too, right? Which is valid. Maybe you're on the same row with somebody and they are earning more, and you're like, oh, I want to go negotiate. Most of the time, people will not just give you the money like that. So it's very important that you're also thinking about yourself, like I mentioned, and you've done your research, right? You've probably researched the policy of the company, you've researched what it means to progress within the company, and even maybe at the beginning of the job, or maybe at the end of the job, you've actually done your research, you've read progression policy, you've read all the kind of policy for progression, you've read, for example, are there places where it has been written in the company policy that you can negotiate if you've gotten some level of experience as well, or you're bringing some level of experience into a role. So it's very important that you read some of those things even before you go into the negotiating table, or even before you accept a job offer, that you've read a company policy, you've read what the progression means, you've read what you're bringing onto the table. So which means that you also have to know yourself, right? What are you bringing to the table? What are your skills? What are your level of expertise? Maybe you might not negotiate if you're getting into an entry level role, or maybe, but if you think that it's worth actually negotiating, if you think that you're bringing something into the table, then you should definitely negotiate. So the first thing is to research. You're researching the company, you're researching the company policy, you're researching the company pay progression, for example, and you are also thinking about yourself in the equation. And it's something that I started doing, because in the beginning of my career, most of the time I don't negotiate. So I had to start thinking that, what am I actually bringing to the table? What are the values I'm bringing to the table? What are my networks, whether tangible networks, both online and in-person network that I'm bringing to a particular role that I'm trying to do. And with all of those skills that I'm bringing, with all of those network, and skills that I'm bringing, those are the things that you can actually quantify in terms of the reason why somebody can pay you or somebody can sign in a contract on a particular basis as well. And a negotiation as well is not a zero-sum game. I think most of the time when we think about negotiation, we think about somebody has to win, somebody has to lose. You also have to think about the person you're negotiating with. You have to think about the company interest as well, right? That negotiation should be a win-win process, not a zero-sum game, not a lose process, not a win-lose process, right? So you need to think about like it's going to be a win-win. So in terms of that, you need to think about if you're coming with your values, right? You're coming with the experiences that you have. You're coming with the skills that you have. You're also coming with that idea that what does that mean for the company in terms of value, right? So you also like coming to the negotiating table in terms of like, if you increase my pay, these are the things I'm going to give you. These are the things I'm going to bring to you. And these are the ways it's going to benefit your company as well. And that's why I said you have to do your research before you actually come onto the negotiating table. I think the mistake that people make is that they don't do their research before they come onto the negotiating table. And when then you come to negotiating table, then how do you then negotiate? If you think it's worth it to negotiate, right? You come there, and one of the things that I've learned again, and these are coming from my experience, is that when you're having this conversation, you detonate, right? I think sometimes when you come into this negotiating room with force, you come into the negotiating room with like, oh, you must pay me, you must increase my money. That doesn't work like that. So you kind of like, in a way, you're reflecting, you're making conversation. You're like, I've been thinking about, for example, I could say that, I really love this company. I love to work here. I love the value of the organization. But I think that the pay isn't fair based on my skills and expertise. And this is the reason why I think it's not fair. I felt like I've done this and I've done this and I've done this. And you're able to explain in that way, rather than just like going into the negotiating table without actually thinking of the way you want to communicate your messages as well. Sometimes it might not land well. So you need to think about like, what does your messaging actually really look like in the negotiating space and in the negotiating table? And the goal is that when you're going into the negotiating table, the goal is that you're thinking of getting something out of that negotiating table. You're thinking of like, these are the things that I want to get from the negotiating table. These are the things that I'm going to get. So if, for example, if maybe you ask for a raise, for example, you've done everything correctly, you've communicated really well, you've done all your research, you've laid what you want on the table, and somebody said that, no, we are not giving you this. One of the ways is, rather than taking that no personally and probably, getting extremely really angry, one of the things you can do is to ask like, what's my plan for progression? What's my plan for increments? And based on the response you get, right? Like obviously you can't pay me this certain amount of money, but what are the plans, do you have for me to actually progress in this company? What are the plans do you have for me in terms of like my pay also increasing, right? So you can know maybe in the next 6 months or in the next 1 year, maybe you can still stick around the company, or maybe you want to work there because there's a potential that you will get an increase as well. That's a way, and if, your boss or the manager or the person who is making the decision or the HR can actually give you an answer that shows that it's going to be promising, maybe then you can stay. But then if you get an answer that is probably not promising and it means that you cannot stick around, again, depending on you, I think this is based on an individual level, depending on you, depending on who you are, depending on the culture of the company, maybe you might start deciding to go to places where you're being, where you'll be, where people would consider your worth and what you're bringing to the table. Maybe it's time to switch the guns. Maybe it's time to switch loyalty as well to somewhere else. Again, all of this actually comes from negotiation, because you can then decide the next step of action, which is something I want to talk about, that depending on the responses you get, you can then talk about the next step of action. And the truth is that even before coming to that space of negotiation, let's look at the scenario or a case of somebody who is already actually working in a company, who have spent about 2 years, and they are trying to negotiate for their pay or their salary, and they are scared that they might not get a raise, or they are scared, or they don't know their worth yet. Maybe then you need to probably do some testing. So one of the things you can do is like maybe dust your CV again, review your CV, go apply for other jobs, go interview for other jobs, and see what your worth is or what your capabilities are. And by interviewing for other jobs, you're able to understand your capabilities, you're able to understand the capability of what you can actually do. And in a couple of those interviews and the feedback you've gotten, let's say imagine you've landed a job, you can come back to your boss or your employer that actually, I've gotten an offer here, but I really don't want to go there because I feel like this is the place I really want to work in. I love here, right? I mean, you're not coming to brag or be like, you're this bravado or bragging, but it can, depending on the responses you get, might determine even if those offer you've gotten, maybe you're going to take it. Or sometimes even if you try other jobs and get to the final, it shows the potential you have. And maybe that can build up your confidence towards also going into the negotiation table. So when you think about the negotiation as well, like you need to think about the processes towards negotiation and how to actually build your confidence up towards actually going onto the negotiating table and to get the better deal and get the better results. Remember that actually going to the negotiating table, the goal is not to make sure you win so that the other person lose. The goal is not to make sure that it's a zero-sum game. The goal is that you both win and the company wins as well, are able to contribute the talent you have, the skills you have to the growth of the company that you're working in, and to communicate that with deep sense of humility and gratitude and respect for yourself first, and for the company you're working with, and for the person you're also talking to. That you're not actually tackling somebody when you're negotiating, you're actually tackling a particular issue. And I think with that, you can actually navigate the negotiation landscape. And again, depending on your response, maybe you just need to leave the company also at the end of the day. Maybe your time is up there. So maybe you can start looking for a job somewhere else. But again, I think those are my thought process around negotiation. The negotiation revolves around research, and we are also very, very important in the equation of actually negotiating for ourselves. Thank you.